Order. I call Jim McMahon to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Chope. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House considers the impact of 5G mast installations on communities in Greater Manchester. I'm grateful for the opportunity to raise this issue, and I appreciate those who have given time to be here today, and for the Minister, who will take time to reply to the debate shortly. This debate covers the powers given to telecommunication companies to install infrastructure on and around the public highway in residential areas, and covers the rollout of 5G on wireless broadband through masts, cabinets and telegraph poles across Greater Manchester. For Oldham, this includes installations primarily by IX Wireless, BT and Vodafone. Now, the British people work hard to provide a good life for themselves and their families, and for many, they are first or second generation homeowners, investing everything they have to form a community with others who share the same hopes, the same fears and the same determination to make it the best it can be. However, these very places are seeing change across the board. Of course, on the matter we're here to talk about today, but also the loss of local pubs, too often being converted to HMOs and even family homes lost to the same use, or the decline of many high streets and town centres and the loss of many community facilities which ought to bind people together. Rather than giving people power in the places where they live, the last 14 years has seen power taken away from communities. And it's this issue, perhaps only known to those who are impacted directly, which must be addressed and is here to be discussed today. And that's the installation of equipment, whether it's 5G or wireless broadband, covering three main areas. Firstly, on planning policy and permitted development. Secondly, on guidance on siting of cabinets and poles. And thirdly, on access to the existing network. Now, on planning policy and permitted development, just imagine a 15-metre mast and cabinets being placed outside your home. A normal... Happy to give way on that point.
I thank my honourable fellow Greater Manchester MP for raising such an important debate today. I have residents in Astley Bridge, Bradshaw, Harwood, Bromley Cross and in Edgerton who are absolutely royally peeved off with the installation of some of these masts going up around the constituency. As you mentioned, 50 metres high, and it looks like something out of a North Korean military base. My residents are completely opposed to this. Does the honourable member believe with me also that both the government, but especially these providers such as IX Wireless, need to listen more to residents and actually have to go through a consultation process to make sure that residents are consulted throughout this? Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention, and I share entirely the concern, but also the impact, and I'll come on a bit later on to some of the interventions we made in Oldham to try and bridge that divide in terms of consultation, communication and co-production. Give way? Yeah.
Can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for bringing this forward and to support the Honourable Gentleman and his claim, which others have referred to, just to give an example from back home, in Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon Council, the very same issue is happening to do with the health and safety concerns of installation of these masts. As residents felt there's a lack of consultation. We all need 5G, understand that, but does the Honourable Member agree that there could perhaps be, there needs to be better communication between local planners regarding installation and safety of these masts being approved? That's what the Honourable Gentleman wants, that's what we want back home.
I think that's the crux of the issue, really, which is that there aren't many people who object on principle to the installation of new equipment that makes life easier and better for people, and connectivity in the digital age is important to that. But how it's done is absolutely critical to garnering community support for that. And I just want to paint the picture of what this means. Imagine you are sat in the house that you have worked hard for, that you are raising your children in, that you have laid down roots in, a normal two-storey house. And the proposal outside is to erect a 15-metre high mast. In context, that's the height of 4 double-decker buses stacked on top of each other. The cabinets that go alongside them are as tall as an adult standing. So these are huge installations that are taking place on residential streets, on cul-de-sacs, on the corners of where people live. And of course, people quite rightly are concerned about the impact of that. Now, I have to give way to my neighbour.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and neighbour who's making a very powerful speech, and I congratulate him. Obviously, my honourable friend is Oldham West, I'm Oldham East, and this is also an issue across Oldham East, going from Shore up to Grasscroft. It is a massive issue. One constituent I called on said literally overnight it had appeared at the end of their garden. But I wondered if my honourable friend would be supporting the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Hull North, who has a private members' bill on this next week and is trying to get the government support that this would be there would be a mandatory consultation process.
Thank you. I absolutely, and recognise completely the impact. I spoke to the member for Kingston upon Hull about the private members' bill that's scheduled. I think the general view is it's quite far down the order paper and it would require the government to lend its support to it. And I would say there will be cross-party support for that. I hear right across the political spectrum that there is a need to address the imbalance here for local people to have their view, and I hope the Minister will take that back for consideration. But the Wi-Fi companies aren't doing anything that isn't allowed and permitted by government, and this is the point. These were changes that were introduced in 2019 in the National Planning Policy Framework, which has created this under permitted development. The impact of that is it's completely removed the requirement to seek prior permission from the local authority and also the public consultation that would then go alongside that. Now, not only do operators have free rein on the siting, but they, with the permissions that are in place, can also, without any further permissions, without any legal agreements, send cables over people's homes with just 2-metre clearances. So you can have a mast erected outside your home and the cable can go across the roof of your home, and you have no legal right to stop that at all because it's all permitted development and it's all licensed under the regulator. And the reality is that councils are left powerless and communities are left voiceless. And even on the siting of cabinets and poles. The House of Commons Library is clear, saying the government's 2016 Cabinet and Pole Siting Code of Practice states that companies should consult with local residents, but it's entirely voluntary. Broadband companies are not legally required to follow the Code of Practice, and Ofcom, the regulator, does not have the power to enforce it. So councils are left powerless, communities are left voiceless, but the regulator is left without the power to regulate as well. Moreover, we know that the scope for upgrading the current 4G mast rather than adding additional 5G ones, working in a way that would minimise the disruption caused by new installations, and this has been the case with, say, BT locally in Oldham. And what about shared use? Because what many will find staggering is how weak the requirement for shared networks and facilities really is. Firstly, the requirement to share existing equipment only rests with BT Openreach. It doesn't rest in areas like ours where we have cable, with Virgin Media, what was then the 9X network, or any of the new operators that are coming in to the market. Now, the operators themselves will say that this is a nonsense. Now, why not allow just one 15-metre mast, but a second one to go alongside it and a third? Because under these rules, it's not just one operator that can install the equipment, another one can come along, another one, and there is no requirement at all to make them work together so that they share the equipment that's then installed. The operators say that's wrong, and I think local people say that's wrong as well. And on legacy. Now, what if any one of these companies, or even if all of these companies, go bust? Then who is responsible for the legacy equipment that's then left on the highway? The fact is, it falls to the local council, who had no say in it being installed to begin with, who now have the financial liability placed on it to deal with the aftermath. And given the rapid pace of change in technology, even now with SpaceX, they're significantly reducing the cost of the Starlink satellite system, and others will follow. So none of us know today what practical commercial lifespan these current 5G masts and fixed wireless units will have in the future, given the rate of technological change coming down the line. And the community impact is felt heavily by many people in Greater Manchester, including constituents of mine in Oldham West, Chadderton and in Royton. Now, many of the 5G masts installed by Vodafone, for instance, are often on main roads or junctions, but it's not always the case. They are large, they change the character of an area. For instance, at Chadderton Hall Park, where the installation abuts the children's play area and community cafe, no effort was made whatsoever to minimise the impact on the visual amenity. So houses that were once looking at a very beautiful park across the road are now looking at this huge telephone equipment that's been installed. However, it's got to be said that most complaints in Oldham West, Chadderton and Royton relate to the IX wireless broadband installations, with some of these being up to 15 metres high, and the installation of the masts don't require any kind of prior planning approval from the council whatsoever. Now, I've raised this issue constantly in Plus for Change. I reached out to the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities in April last year, but we didn't even receive a response from the department on this issue that is so important. This fueled already the mistrust in the local community. It was central government who brushed local communities to one side and who ignored then the legitimate representations from MPs. But it didn't help, and I'll be blunt about this, that the same company had recently been reported to have paid £138,000 to 24 Tory MPs as donations in the region, at a point when we should be rebuilding trust in politics. Things like this really do undermine that effort. Now, my approach is always that we have to bring competing interests together to find common ground. And on this issue, we have to find a way that balances the need to expand connectivity in a way that brings local people on board. And so I wrote to both Oldham Council and IX Wireless asking for intervention and for a different approach. I'll be honest, it wasn't without some challenges. These things quite often are. But we eventually were able to get an agreement to have a more inclusive way forward. Firstly, to work through the sites which were of concern, and so in July, we held a meeting with the support of my fantastic contingency staff in Chadderton Town Hall, where we held a residents' workshop to act as an arbiter between the two sides. And I'm grateful to BBC Radio Manchester for reporting on the same issue late last year too. Now, the workshop gave an opportunity for residents to meet with IX Wireless to go through site by site its impact. Some changes were made, for instance, using more underground cabling, relocating cabinets and masts, or removing the need for them at all. Happy to give way on that point.
Thank you for giving away again. It's very generous. We have found we've been successful on a couple of occasions in having relocations of the masts. One example in Bradshaw recently, but then the unfortunate thing was that this was moved only a matter of 50 metres away, and we have to keep the constant pressure on IX Wireless. The same is true in Edgerton. Councillor Nadeem Muslim was successful in making sure a pole wasn't erected there, but what level of success has the Honourable Member had in ensuring centralised meetings that these posts are mass placed in places that residents don't want?
And so the approach we tried to take was to, where possible, to use the underground ducting that was there through the BT Open Reach system, and we were able to remove some masts and cabinets completely because of that, and residents were clearly delighted that the cabinet that was proposed eventually was removed. In some cases, we were able to move them around the corner, if that meant it could be near a garage site rather than outside somebody's living room window. And so it would still be in the locality, but at least it would be diminished in terms of its impact. In other cases where it couldn't be moved at all, even getting an agreement to paint them the colour of the background. If it's against a wall, to paint it the colour of the wall. If it's against a park, to paint it the green of the park. Or even to be creative, and we've suggested to IX Wireless, that Royton has a very proud history of remembering its veterans, and the British Legion in Royton do a fantastic job, and they've done a great job of pulling together the histories of servicemen who lost their lives in the Second World War. And they're open to using some of the cabinets that can't be moved to vinyl wrap to celebrate the sacrifice that people gave for our freedom. And I think where we can bring people in to compromise like that, we can bring people with us. But in the end, some people will just not want this equipment outside their homes, and that's very difficult. But we should always try and find common ground. And I think what I struggle with is the system almost is designed to write local people out of the process at a time when there is so much mistrust in politics and politicians that we should be using every opportunity to bring people together in the same room to work through these difficult issues together. And hopefully, I've explained what we were able to do in my constituency thanks to the hard work of my staff and the willingness of the operator and the local authority. But it shouldn't be voluntary. We should have this hardwired into what we do. But I would also say that we have been able to make a degree of progress where the law doesn't require prior approval, but we have managed to get an agreement with IX Wireless and Oldham Council that they will apply as if they were required to have prior approval. So they will make the application, they will give the notice, and because of that, the public consultation that would be natural and normal in a planning application then does take place as part of that process. And so, even though it's not required, we are seeing in Oldham that process is underway. But it's important that consultation is a genuine consultation and not just an admin process that doesn't deliver the outcome that local people want. And so it's got to be seen as that partnership. Now, there remains work to be done. And though, of course, we've made progress, I would urge Irish Wireless to find a way to remove, to relocate, or to redesign the remaining contentious proposed installations, including one on Denberdale Way in Royton, where local people have a legitimate concern about the implications of that and just how disruptive it will be to the street scene in that area. Now, digital inclusion should enhance communities and bring people together. It shouldn't increase tensions and hurt our neighbourhoods. Consistent Conservative top-down implementation has to change, and community power must be respected, not to block, but to build the future together. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the impact of 5G mast installations on communities in Greater Manchester. Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Chope, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I would like to commend the member for Oldham West and Royton for arranging this debate on this huge issue which is impacting so many of our constituents in Greater Manchester. He has already made some very important points about the technicalities of the law on this and how changes to permitted development have caused chaos on the streets of Bolton and across our borough. I have been raising this issue and concern since 2019 about poorly sited and low-quality masts and wooden poles placed across Bolton. Mr. Chope, these are very tall, very ugly monstrosities who are blighting our landscape and causing so much distress to my constituency in Bolton South East. It has become a case of whack-a-mole with these masts, boxes and poles popping up everywhere. You get one recited and then the other appears in a different area. We've had them on private land, placed on dangerous road bands, and right up against residents' walls, making access for essential pointing impossible. All this causes huge distress and has resulted in a sense of powerlessness from our local residents. Indeed, in my Saturday drop-in advice surgery only last week, I had a constituent come and talk about more recent one of these being placed, and so next to his side wall that he said if there was any problem with his wall, he'd have to break the whole wall down to be able to repair it because of the location of this particular thing. So, and these companies don't give any warning that they're going to commence in the area. There's no consultation done to anyone. The first people see is these stupid, horrendous things outside their homes. But the main point I also want to emphasize and raise with the Minister is the economic value of allowing all these companies to dig up our roads and pavements without any type of oversight. I have asked ministers several times and written letters to say whether the government actually tracks the commercial viability of these companies that it has allowed to place their infrastructure on private land. And the reply is always no. The government is not even collecting data on whether this policy of permitted development is driving the growth it was meant to, and whether any of the companies sticking up these ugly things are commercially viable, or whether they are actually using technology that is viable even in short term. Many people like me will argue that the visible appearance of these things suggests that these are not exactly cutting edge of industry innovations. For our part in Bolton, we don't need these and we don't want them. Bolton is actually very well served by broadband providers, and these area masts going up we already have ample of coverage of our area. So we don't need these masts. And I don't think the Bolton public will forgive those who have allowed companies free rein to blight our landscape for no economic benefit to them other than for someone somewhere to make a quick buck. So I would urge the Minister, please can this be revisited, and if there are going to be any such placement put, that there's a proper consultation and an issue of permission to be given before they're installed.
Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I hope we will not be interrupted by votes as I seek to reply to this debate. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Oldham, West and Royton for calling this debate on the impact of 5G connectivity on communities in Greater Manchester, and also for the attendance of his constituency neighbours. I very much appreciate hearing what's going on the ground. It's very useful to hear. And it sounds like there is some very good partnership work going on thanks to his efforts in relation to how to get the council, community and the provider to work more productively together. Certainly.
Thank you for giving way, Minister. I think along with my colleague next door in Bolton South East, it does feel in Bolton North East that we're a whack-a-mole team. And we have the councillors Toby Hewitt, Hilary Fairclough, along with Madasser Dean, having to go out week to week or every month to try and whack them all. What I think is great about having this debate today is I hope that the Department can consider ways in which we can review current legislative measures and to ensure that these providers, especially at IX Wireless in the case of Bolton North East, is that there is much more consultation, because at the moment these massive masts going up, it's almost like a middle finger to the local community, a middle finger to consultation and to peaceful living environment.
There you go.
Well, I thank you for his intervention. It sounds that he has some very hard-working councillors, and I commend them for their efforts, but they shouldn't have to be playing whack-a-mole in this way. It's very time-intensive and likely unnecessary. What I'm trying to establish as a minister is the extent of the problem, and I know that this is an issue in pockets of the country, and I think the fact that there are a number of Greater Manchester MPs here today is testament to that, notwithstanding it's a debate about the specific area. There's also a specific challenge in relation to the Hull area, and reference was made to the private members' bill being put down by the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull North, where there are specific issues with the way in which the market operates in the Kingston and Hull area. And it seems like there are particular challenges in the Greater Manchester area with specific operators. And I'm going to be holding a roundtable with colleagues, I believe next week, where I hope that we will get a better sense of how geographically widespread this is, or whether it's specific actions we need to take against particular providers or deal with specific issues on the ground in relation, particularly in relation into Hull. And I'm also going to be meeting Ofcom next week as well, when I hope to discuss this in some detail. So I shall just set out the general policy aim, if I may, and then I shall set out the next steps that we're going to be taking to address communities' concerns. And it's absolutely right that they are addressed, because this is not what we seek to happen. There is an overall and well-supported policy aim in relation to connectivity. We do not want that broad support for that connectivity agenda to be undermined by bad practice. Because as the House knows, reliable, fast digital connectivity is absolutely vital for the prosperity of our country, and we're working very hard to make sure that communities across the UK can get those services at prices they can afford. And this is not just about connectivity needs now. Increasingly, we're going to see healthcare delivered in a technologically enabled way. We're going to see more education provided in that way, economic opportunities. So for me as Minister, it's very important that we make sure that every part of the country has fantastic connectivity. I do not want to see a digital divide emerge. And so whilst the Honourable Gentleman talked about this being a disempowering thing for communities, that is precisely the opposite of our intention. The policy intention is to empower communities by making sure they have the infrastructure they need. I do not want them to feel that this is leading to a deterioration in the overall amenity of their areas. Certainly.
So I think there's agreement on the need for this rollout of digital connectivity and a welcome investment. The frustration for local people is, and the industry actually, is that there isn't coordination across government. So the example that was given on the call earlier on today with a provider was they would love nothing more than to use the lamppost infrastructure on streets that are already in place to be able to install the devices within the lamppost, but they can't do that because they can't get an agreement here or through local authorities to enable that to happen. So that seemed like a very logical way. We need to look at charging points for electric vehicles and how that might happen. We need to look at wireless connectivity as well. This just requires a bit of joined-up thinking from the government. How do you make best use of what we've already got?
I thank him. It's an interesting intervention. I've not ever discussed the idea of sharing lampposts or infrastructure of that nature. when I, not long after becoming Minister in this particular policy area, one of the pieces of legislation I put through was the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Bill. The precise intention of that bill was to make it easier to share existing infrastructure, to crack open some of the monopolies we'd seen in relation to telecoms, and to make it easier for new companies and new entrants to provide that connectivity, because communities' connectivity was getting behind because of that monopoly interest. And I think that ultimately there has been a much faster rollout, and the whole intention is that that rollout is done not through new poles, new masts and all the rest of it, notwithstanding the fact that they will be required in some areas, but to have much better sharing of existing infrastructure. So I will take away the point that he raises in relation to other types of infrastructure, certainly.
I think this has been very generous with the intervention. Just on that point, and the Act in itself was a good piece of work, with the exception of the guidance that then followed, which essentially allows the sharing requirement to be one of requesting that it's considered rather than requiring it to happen. And I think if the government was just to be more directive and say, no, if it's there, you ought to use it together, rather than just asking for people to have a conversation about it. Yes,
well, I don't want to mislead the House in any way. My understanding is that on some companies, particularly Openreach, there are requirements on infrastructure sharing, but that is not universal. And that may be something that we come to review in future. But just to sort of set out the overall success levels, because I don't want this all to be about the negative side. I mean, ultimately, I think this has driven rollout. It's just that there are particular problems, as I alluded, in particular geographical areas where I think there is something we need to be doing in relation to whether that's Hull and making sure that infrastructure is better shared, or whether it's in particular operators who are probably operating in a way that is certainly not the intention of the code and guidance. But in 2019, we had 6% of UK premises with access to gigabit-capable broadband. That's now 81%. So you see, it's been a massive difference in connectivity. And I think we all understand from the pandemic just how important that connectivity is to people's life chances now. This is effectively akin to a key utility, and we want to make sure that people are not disadvantaged by having that poor connectivity. So I'm very proud of that achievement. And we have to make sure that infrastructure deployment can continue at pace. And we know that the legislative framework has been supportive of that. And we want operators to be able to install infrastructure quickly, but that is not some kind of one-way street. And I think, we have to make sure that operators understand this is not something without restriction. The legislation rightly recognises that there can be an impact of network deployment on communities and the environment, and there is a balance to be had, and rules to which telecoms companies ought to be adhering. And good operators, I think, understand that. And as I say, I think there is an issue with bad actors, bad examples that we are very keen that we drill down into. The Honourable Member will be aware of the legislative framework. He spoke about it in some detail, and that's to make sure that the vital infrastructure can be deployed quickly while ensuring that communities can have their say. And this is supported by best practice guidance on where new infrastructure should be placed and how best to limit the impact on the landscape and our streets. The legislation also ensures that either Ofcom or the local or planning authority can take enforcement action when either the regulations or the planning rules aren't being adhered to. Local planning authorities have powers to take enforcement action where they believe planning regulations are contravened. And I understand this has actually already happened and is actively underway in some parts of Greater Manchester. I think there is a piece of work to do about helping local authorities understand how and when they can push back on some of these applications. And some of the applications are being, from my feedback I've had from local authorities, some of these applications are being put forward by planning consultants rather than the companies themselves, and so they're not using that local knowledge and having that accountability. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to just set out some of the extra steps that we will be taking. And as I mentioned, we are... the policy aim now is to make sure that there's better infrastructure sharing. But on Monday, I will be meeting with Melanie Dawes, the Chief Executive of Ofcom, to ask that her officials work closely with mine to bring about a swift resolution to some of the challenges that have been raised in this chamber this afternoon and also previously. This follows a letter from the Technology Secretary that asked Ofcom to set out the conditions under which they would take enforcement actions if the regulations are not being adhered to. As I suggested, I will also be holding a roundtable for concerned colleagues on the 25th of March. The Honourable Gentleman will be very, very welcome to join me. I look forward to hearing his constituents' concerns in more detail, and also to pick up some of the issues that he raised and we don't have time to go into today. We will be working very closely with the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities to support local planning authorities, exploring what extra steps are needed, and I'm going to be writing this week to operators and their representative bodies to make sure they're aware of how seriously we're taking this and what we expect them to do to minimise unnecessary infrastructure. I hope this provides some assurance in terms of the immediate next steps, but I want to assure him that we are listening to the concerns being raised in this House, and we are open to slightly tougher steps if we are dissatisfied with progress. I'm conscious of time, so I shall let him wrap up.
The question is that this House has considered the impact of 5G mast installations on communities in Greater Manchester.